Hello and welcome. We're here to talk briefly about open source software for news media. I'm Dagmar Cass, coordinator of the Prague Media Point, and here with me is Gregory Bruno, communications manager of Sourcefabric, which is a Prague-based developer for open source tools for news media. So welcome, Gregory.
Thanks very much for having me. It's great to be here.
Let's delve into it. How important is open source software to the news business?
Yeah, I mean, it's increasingly critically important. A recent survey found that something like 78% of businesses across sectors use some form of open source technology in their tech stack. Open source makes a lot of sense, and we're moving away from kind of the strictly proprietary closed black box type of system that we saw in the past.
So it seems to me that there's a wide range of subjects that open source could be used for. So what types of open source projects are we seeing in journalism?
Yeah, no, it's a good question, and we should differentiate here, I think, in terms of what we mean when we say the word open source. So on the one hand, when we talk about open source in journalism, we have open source platforms and tools which aid the reporting process. And then on the other hand, we have technology that's built on open source code that powers that technology. So one way to think about it is the former is kind of more like a Wikipedia in that non-tech people can contribute to it and use it. And the latter requires the ability to write and understand code to some level. So on the open source platform tool side, the sky's the limit. We're seeing tons and tons of initiatives, everything from from aiding reporters in the reporting process, helping do with transcriptions, to document sharing, to open data analysis and social media investigative tools. We're seeing news organizations, big and small, use open source as a way to engage audiences, to collaborate with each other. Big names like ProPublica and the New York Times and Bellingcat, an open source investigative outfit, which I'm sure many of us are aware of, are kind of at the forefront of the open source revolution in journalism when it comes to tools and platforms. But we're even seeing smaller outfits, organizations in Brazil, for instance. There's one called Brazil.io, which is fascinating. It's using open source tools to obtain unstructured data that it's then making available to citizen journalists, everything from data on health to government spending. That's on the kind of the tools and the platform side. On the other side, the creation of technology based on open source code, that's what Sourcefabric does. And we're seeing that in some circles, but frankly, it still has a long way to go in terms of developing and using open source tools for the technology that is powering a newsroom.
So you say it still has a long way to go. What are the biggest hurdles to open source software adoption in journalism? Talk about some of those reasons.
Yeah. So in terms of when I say a long way to go, I'm talking more in, again, the reliance and development of open source code and open source technology that's essentially being built by the journalists themselves. So when we use open source tools for our reporting, we're not usually writing the code. But more and more news organizations that we work with are writing the code in-house for the technology that's powering their operations. But what the hurdles are to doing that is it's hard. It requires capacity from a technology and IP perspective that not a lot of news organizations have invested in. There's also institutional inertia. It might be easier to buy one, buying one from, the Washington Post, which is selling their ARC CMS, or from Vox Media, which is selling Chorus. And the other challenge is that with open source, the possibilities are really endless in terms of flexibility and configuration with your legacy systems. And that can be actually quite daunting.
Sure, but you are the advocate for the open source solution. So why is it a better choice?
Yeah, I mean, of course, cost. I mentioned flexibility. Cost. The price for open source implementation is significantly lower than going with a proprietary solution. Flexibility. you can connect it with your older systems. It doesn't require from day one a complete overhaul and trade out of what you're using. So let's say you have an older photo archive, for instance. You don't need a new damn digital asset management system up and running from day one to implement an open source CMS to power your operations. You can connect it. There's ways to do that. But I think there's also something philosophical here in that open source is kind of aligned with some of the ideological ways that journalists think about their craft. The disciplines are kindred spirits in many ways, historically motivated less by proprietary, profit-driven control, although that needs to change in some ways for the news business to survive and prosper. But this interest in kind of the communal good, the simple idea that with open source, your code is transparent. It's kind of seen as a way to build trust. If members of the public could see how our systems are built, similarly see how we do our stories and what data we're using to report, then the thinking is that trust in that relationship is strengthened.
Mm-hmm. So let's just briefly touch, what you do with Sourcefabric.
Mm-hmm.
I know that you are trying to increase development collaboration,
Mm-hmm.
and that is, why you're launching these new initiatives, like the Superdesk Wire Club. So tell us very briefly, what is Superdesk and what is Superdesk Wire Club?
Yeah, sure. So Superdesk is a CMS. It's a kind of head, a full, complete package for managing all aspects of your newsroom operation, from publishing to ideation to planning to creation, even distribution. It's a headless CMS, which means that there's no front end, so there's no visual display. And this has an advantage in that you can connect it, a headless CMS, with any front end. So a headless CMS can be connected to WordPress, for instance. Even though WordPress is a CMS, it's quite limited in its workflow and its ability to publish to multi-tenancies. That's one of Superdesk's great advantages. It can publish to many websites. So if you're a bigger news organization that operates lots of different smaller microsites, you can publish all from the same place. That's the background on what Superdesk is. What makes it special in our view is that it was co-developed. It was created in close partnership with the Australian Associated Press and the National News Agency of Norway. And we built it together, developers sitting alongside journalists, ideating what does your CMS as a wire service, as a news agency, as a journalist, what does it need to do? How does it need to function? And so in that way, Superdesk is really, the journalists' CMS. It was built with them, for them. To develop that collaboration further and to kind of mature it, what we built in the last year is something called the Superdesk Wire Club. And what the Wire Club is we invited Superdesk users, many of whom happen to be some of the world's largest news organizations. I mentioned AAP in Australia and NTB in Norway, but we also partner with the Canadian press. They use Superdesk, Belga, the news agency of Belgium, and others. And we invited them to join us in the Wire Club. And what the Wire Club is it's an opportunity for all of us to sit down, share ideas, and really chart out the future of a shared CMS that's co-developed, that's open source, and is thinking about the future in the way that the news organizations themselves are evolving and developing. So that has some benefits. The benefits are that it's, there's a seat at the development table, meaning that as a user, as a newsroom organization that's using it, you get a say in how it's developed. That's not something that happens in proprietary software. And it's not something that happens in open source very often either. You think about WordPress, that's open source. But you don't get to tell WordPress necessarily which widgets you want and how the functionality of the site and the UI is going to look. Mm-hmm. At the Wire Club, journalists have that opportunity. Mm-hmm. And then the added benefit for the industry is that because it's open source and because the tool is constantly updated and the code sits freely, openly on GitHub, any news organization that wants to use it benefits from the work that the Wire Club is doing. So there's a great kind of knock-on follow effect.
Well, thank you. This is very interesting and informative. And our time is up, unfortunately.
Oh, I could go on for hours.
I'd like to thank you, Gregory, and I'd like to invite everyone, if you have any questions, reach out to Gregory through his conference profile. And thank you, and enjoy the conference.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.